So this week is Parshas Boy. But before starting this year, I feel so strongly that I must say a few words of introduction. We are at the height of the pandemic in Eretz Yisrael. And in Eretz Yisrael, we are at the worst stage, worse than it has ever been in the past year. And it is so sad, so tragic, and so unbelievably sad, because we see the light at the end of the tunnel. More than 2 million people were vaccinated. And we have thousands of new cases every day. And many young people have passed away in the past week or two. Presently, there are 10 young women in various different stages of pregnancy that are critically ill. Their life is in danger, and the babies waiting to be born, chas v'sholom, might never come to be. And this could have been prevented. It could have been prevented. People are dying. Many new Yisayimim just in the last week, in the last 10 days. And many of us still are in denial. Big chasanas, big bar mitzvahs. So people dance and sing, and others will die because they preferred to dance and sing. This is so tragic. So this week we have our bar mitzvah, my anicle. It is going to be in my backyard. Only immediate family. This is the second bar mitzvah during Corona. And the first one was also only immediate family, very small. So I promised each of my einiklech that became bar mitzvah in this period 1,000 shekel of svarim, more than they would get if they would have a normal bar mitzvah. Just I want the kids to be happy. But life is more important than anything else. And what will we say to our Talmidim next time we will learn halachas of pikuach nefesh? And I might ask, did you practice what you preached? Are we chas v'sholem nu adoirish v'einay noem ekayim? So I beg and I plead and I cry to all of you. It is futile. It is senseless. We're almost at the end of this pandemic. Wear masks. Distance yourselves one from another. Have simchas with family. Isn't family more important than anyone else at your chasan, at your bar mitzvah, at your bris? So, in these parshas we are reading about Golas Mitzrayim and Yetzias Mitzrayim. Shiyitkayem banu kol ha'machalo asher samti b'Mitzrayim lo yosem olecho ki ani Hashem roifecho. So this week is Parshas Boy, and in Parshas Boy, amongst all the other sigyas and all the other mitzvahs, we learn about Shvisa b'Yom Tov. And today we will be focusing on Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliyos. We spoke about Hilchas Yom Tov many times in the past, about Erev Tavshilin and related topics. Today, our focus is on Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliyos. What is Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliyos? Is it a chiyuv or a minhag? Even if it's a minhag, it's still a chiyuv. Twice in Shas, Chazal asked the fundamental question, how do we know that a minhag is binding? Shema b'ni musar avicho, va'al titosh toiras imecho. That's the very first perek of Sefer Mishlei, Posuk Ches. And the emphasis is on the Sefer, al titosh toiras imecho. I think that obviously the father is the one that teaches Torah. what is permissible and what is prohibited, what are the mitzvahs aseh, what are the mitzvahs lo ta'aseh. It is the mother that teaches her children, how do we conduct our affairs? How does a Jewish home look? What is the spirit and the nefesh of a Jewish home? And therefore, minhag is based on al titosh toiras imecho. And many times in this modern world, people come to me and they ask a shaila and they say, Rabbi, we only want to know halacha. Don't tell us anything, only halacha. And I say, only halacha. Minhag is halacha. And halacha includes our Mesorah. And it's twice in Shas. Menolan de minhag miltai, al titosh toiras imecho. Yes, minhagim are binding. And the Rambam goes so far as to say, minhagim are included in loitosur mekol asher yagidu lacha. The Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim, and once again in the introduction of the Rambam. So what is Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goriyos? In Beit Zedav Dalad Amid Beis, the Gemara asks the fundamental question. In days of yore, there were Mekadesh as a Chodesh al Piriyah. So people living in Chutz La'aretz and faraway places didn't know when the Beis Din in Eretz Yisrael was Mekadesh the Chodesh, when is the Chodesh. So it was a necessity. Because they had a suffix, they held 2 days. Well, they didn't have WhatsApp, they didn't have SMS, they didn't have email, they didn't even have phones. So how would they know when the Beis Din in Eretz Yisrael Mekadesh as a Chodesh? So, being in doubt, they needed to hold 2 days. The Gemara asks, today we have a luach, we have a calendar. We no longer have Mekadesh al Piriyah, so why do we hold 2 days? His haru b'minhag aviseichem b'yadeichem. And this loshon seems to indicate it's a minhag. His haru b'minhag aviseichem b'yadeichem. But Rashi on the spot, in Beit Zedav Dalad Amid Beis, Rashi writes, choik kavua mitkones chachamim. Is that a contradiction? Not at all. It was the chachamim that were asked, why do we keep 2 days? And it is the chachamim that said, his haru b'minhag aviseichem b'yadeichem. Yes. Essentially, it's a minhag, but it's a minhag that chachamim were metaken. His haru b'minhag aviseichem b'yadeichem. And this is also obvious in the Rambam. So I want to read together with you 3 halachas in Rambam. Number 1 is Perek Vav Melchus Yom Tov Halacha Yudaled. And I'm reading the Rambam. Kol advarim ha'ilu shamanu hayu bizman shayu Beis Din shel Eretz Yisrael mekadshon al pi hariyah. V'hayu b'nei hagoyla oisin shnei yomim kedei leistalek min hasafek lefi shelo hayu yodim yom shekidshu b'nei Eretz Yisrael. Aval hayom sheb'nei Eretz Yisrael soimchem al hacheshbon umekadshon olav ein yom tov sheni leistalek min hasafek ela minhag belvad. Yom Tov Sheni is no longer lestalak min hasafek. It is only a minhag. Minhag? How about the Rambam Perek Halacha Hey Filches Kiddush HaChodesh? בזמן הזה שאין שם סנהדרין ובייסין של ארץ ישראל קויבים על חשבון זה. היה מרדין שהוא בכל המקויים עושים יום טוב אחד בלבד. אפילו מקויים הרחוקים שבחוץ לארץ, כמו בני ארץ ישראל. שהכל על חשבון אחד סומכים וקובעים. אבל תקונס חכמים היא שיזהרו במנהג אביסיהם שבידיהם. Exactly the way I explained Rashi. תקונס חכמים היא שיזהרו במנהג אביסיהם שבידיהם. And once again, פרק א', הלכה חוף א', הלכס יום טוב. זה שאנו עושים בחוץ לארץ, כל יום טוב מאלו 2 יומים מנהגו, ויום טוב שני מדברי סופרם הוא. מנהגו, ויום טוב שני מדברי סופרם הוא. Is that a takona or a minhag? It is both. The takona is that we adhere to the minhag. So that's the basic idea of Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliyos. And I want to bring another precedent, another source. Minag that becomes halacha. Nida samach vov amud aleph. Benois Yisrael achmiru latzman afiru royes tippes dam kechad liyoshas shivo nikiyim. This lotion indicates it is a minag. Benois Yisrael achmiru latzman. But on brochas lamed aleph amud aleph, when the Gemara says, Ein oimdim lehispar elela metoich halacha psuka, and Chazal give several different examples. What is halacha psuka? One of them is Benois Yisrael tippes dam kechad liyoshas shivo nikiyim. Is it a minag or halacha psuka? It is both. Essentially a minig that becomes halacha. I think there's a difference between these two examples. Yom Tov Sheni Shegolias on one hand, and Shiva Nekiyim Benid on the other. When Chazal say, Zarek b'minig avisechem shebiyadechem b'yom Tov Sheni Shegolios, minig avisechem wasn't a minig. Minig avisechem was halacha, because in those days, Yom Tov Sheni was le'estalek min hasofik. It was a sveika diuraisa. Al pi halacha, they needed to keep 2 days. B'nois Yisrael achmiru al atzmam, this entire idea was a minhag, but it is a minhag that evolves into halacha. And that could happen in 2 different ways. Maybe at some stage Chachamim were metaken. This minhag is so important, and it makes so much sense. It is as if Bnei Yisrael had Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, and therefore Chachamim were metaken that they need to hold Shiva Nekiyim. Or maybe Tshuvas Marshal Semin Vav. And the Mashal is quoted by the Shach in Reish Yud Daled Yoredei Asiv Kod Daled, and by the Pri Chodesh in Or Chaim Tov Tzadik Vav. The Marshal says, Kol minag shenes pasheit b'kol beis Yisrael has the essence of Davar Shenesa B'minyan, like at the Konos Chachamim. The Rashal differentiates between local minhagim, a minig of a family, a minig of a city, a minig of a tribe. Minig shenes pashet b'kol Yisrael is the same level as at the Konos Chachamim, and maybe that is why. But that has the harshness, the validity of it, the Konos Chachamim, and it becomes halacha psuka. Coming back to Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliyos. So I explained Rashi and the Rambam. It is both a minig and a halacha, a takana. It's quite clear in the Rambam, in the 3 sources that I brought from the Rambam. And it's Rashi, because the Gemara says, Zarav b'nig avesechem, and Rashi writes, Tekones Chachamim. But I still think it's a machloikes in Rishonim, and there are 2 different approaches. So there's a big machloikes between the Rishonim. Do we say a brocha on a minhag? Machloikes, Rambam and Tosfos, B'nai Ashkenaz and B'nai Sfarad. The Rambam in Hilchos Brochas clearly says we don't say a brocha on a minhag, and that is why we don't say a brocha on Halal B'Rosh Chodesh. Halal B'Rosh Chodesh is only a minhag, and that's why we don't say Halal Sholem. Ki mevor b'brochas daf Yudalad. And Tosfos in Brochas daf Yudalad maintains we do say Halal with a brocha on Rosh Chodesh. According to Tosfos, we say a brocha on a minhag. And in Tov Chav Beis, it's a machlokes Beis Yosef and Ramo. The Beis Yosef, as always, follows in the footsteps of the Rambam. According to the Shulchan Aruch, the Beis Yosef, we don't say a brocha on Halal B'Rosh Chodesh. The Ramo adheres to Gedolei Ashkenaz, Rashi, and Bari and Tosfos. The Ramo says we do say Halal with a brocha on Rosh Chodesh. Sfardim don't say, and Ashkenazim do. There are 2 Hasidic dynasties that don't say a brocha on Halal B'Rosh Chodesh in Eretz Yisrael, Slonim and Karlin. Why is that? They're not Sfardim. They're purely Ashkenazim. Most Hasidic Chatzeres established themselves in Eretz Yisrael after the Holocaust. Slonim and Karlin were the first 2 Hasidic groups that came to Eretz Yisrael more than 100 years ago. And when they came to Eretz Yisrael, they took upon themselves Minhag Eretz Yisrael, and the Beis Yosef reigned supreme. Morada Aradi Yisrael. And that is why Sladom and Kalin don't say a brocha on Halal B'Rosh Chodesh. So Tosfos and Sukkah Mem Daled Amud Beis wants to prove that we do say a brocha on a minhag, because we say Kiddush Leil Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliyos. It's only a minhag. So how do we say Kiddush? Tosfos says Doicha. Tosfos rejects this argument. And Tosfos says, the problem of saying a brocha on a minhag is only how could we say Vitzivonu if it's not a tzivui? But in Kiddush, you don't say Vitzivonu. Kiddush is Berchas HaShevach. It's not Berchas HaMitzvah. So we don't have that problem. So obviously, Tosfos maintains Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliyos is a minhag. And that is why Tosfos argues, does this prove that we say a brocha on a minhag? The Ran totally rejects Tosfos, and he has a gewaldige kasha on Tosfos. Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliyos, second Seder night, we say Asher Kadeshonu b'mitzvos v'tzivono, al achilas matzah, al achilas moror, so we do say v'tzivono. And this is Berchas HaMitzvah. It's not Kiddush. So the Ran says, Kushya mi'ikora leisa, because Yom Tov Sheni is not a minhag, it's a takana. So it is clear, Tosfos maintains it's a minhag, the Ran maintains it's a takana. Ramban, Shabbos Chov Gimel. When the Gemara asks regarding Chanukah, Heichen Tzivonu, Melo Yisasur, the Ramban says, and how about Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliyos? It's only a minhag. The Ramban says, no, it's not a minhag, it's a takana. Shabbos Chov Gimel, Ritva Rosh Hashanah Chov Ches. So the Ramban, the Ritva, Ran, say it's a takana. Tosfos maintains it's a minhag, Sukkah Mem Daled. And Apsochim Dafnun, you find the same in Balamoa and in the Ravad. They also maintain Yom Tov Sheni is a minhag. So we do have a machlokes rishonim. But nevertheless, I say what I mentioned at the beginning of the Shiur, even if it is a minhag, it still is a chiyuv. Al titosh toiras imecho. There's a gewaldige svara from the Brisker Rov, and to me it's so appealing, it's so geschmack. As always, the Brisker Rov's Torah. So the Ran asks, according to Tosfos, we don't say a brocha on a minhag, so how about matzah and moror, second night of Yom Tov Rishon Shel Pesach? How do we say a brocha? It's a minhag. So the Brisker Rov says, why does Tosfos and the Ramo maintain we don't say a brocha on a minhag? Is it because minhag is not that binding? No. The Rambam says minhag is loitasur. And don't we learn in Shabbos Daf Chov Gimel Heichen Tzivonu meloisasur? The Rambam in Hilchos Mavrim says minhagim are included in loisasur. So anything that comes from brisk has to do with gavra and chefza. So the Brisker Rov explains. The chefza of a minhag is not the chefza of a mitzvah. The problem isn't with the word vitzivanu. The problem is asher kiddushono b'mitzvotav vitzivanu. A mitzvah is a mitzvah and a minhag is a minhag. Minhag is binding. Minhag might even be included in Leisasur. It definitely is al titosh toiras imecho. But in essence, it's not the same concept as a mitzvah. Mitzvahs are mitzvahs, and minhagim are minhagim. And we don't say a brocha on minhagim. So the Brisker Rov argues, matzah and moror are mitzvahs. However, they're not mitzvahs only on Pesach, first night Pesach. Matzah on Purim is not a mitzvah. Moror on Rosh Hashanah is not a mitzvah. But once we have the minhag of Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliyos, matzah and moror are cheftzeh shel mitzvah. Halal Rosh Chodesh is not a cheftzeh shel mitzvah. It's like matzah Rosh Hashanah, like moror Purim, because Rosh Hashanah is not a Yom Tov. Beyond that, it's not halal shalom, so it can be a cheftzeh the mitzvah. It's only Chotzi Halal. And that is why, according to Tosfos, we don't say a bracha. But matzah, the second night, is the same as the first night. It's the same cheftzeh the mitzvah. Yom Tov Sheni is the golus. Yom Tov Sheni Shegolis is the minag. But once we have Yom Tov Sheni Shegolis, matzah mora cheftzeh the mitzvah, and therefore we say a bracha. This Biskarov to me is very appealing. Let's get back to Yom Tov Sheni Shegolis. So some Rishonim maintain it's a minhag, others maintain it's a chiyuv derabanan. Rashi and the Rambam combine the both. 150 years ago, there was a huge machlokes in Brod. Brod was one of the Choshev Kehelas in Galicia. The Rav in the city of Brod at the time was the Yad HaMelech. Rabbi Elazar Lando was a grandson of the Nogi Yehuda. Reb Shloime Kluger was the Magid Meishorim. Interesting. Because the Yad HaMelech wasn't a great posek, lecha oira. He didn't write Shalos Tshuvos. I'm not even aware that there are tshuvos from the Yad HaMelech in the svarim of his contemporaries. Very few. I do not recall any tshuvos from the Yad HaMelech. But he did write Yad HaMelech and Rambam, which is a purely Lamdish sefer. If it would be up to me, I would make Reb Shloime Kluger the Rav, because he was posek gadol, and I would appoint the Yad HaMelech as the Rosh Hashiva. But it wasn't the way it was. So the Yad HaMelech was the Rav, Reb Shloime Kluger was the Magid. And Reb Shloime Kluger disputed and disagreed with many psukim of the Yad HaMelech. He even wrote a sefer called Shivo Einayim, which is a compilation of all the psukim of the Yad HaMelech, which Reb Shloime Kluger rejected. And because Reb Shloime Kluger was much younger than the Yad HaMelech, whenever he disagreed with the Rav, he turned to the Gedolim, and usually all the Gedolim, the elderly Gedolim, agreed with Reb Shloime Kluger, which is just a historic fact. Masa shahoyo kachoyo. There was a shechiv mara, a person desperately ill, and he was dying. And he was worried about his wife because they had no children. And he had a brother living in a far away America. And he was afraid that if he dies and he doesn't give a get to his wife, she will never be able to get married again. Because he doubted that his brother would give chalitza. So he was desperate to give her a get. And it was Yom Tov Sheni. And the Yad HaMelech said, Yom Tov Sheni Shegolis is only a minag. So he was matter to write a get and give the get on Yom Tov Sheni Shegolis. And Reb Shloime Kluger was furious about that psak. And he turned to the Chassam Sofer. Tshuvas Chassam Sofer, Kuf Mem Hey Orachayim. We find the tshuva of the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer agrees with Reb Shloime Kluger, and he says that psak is not correct. But what is significant in this tshuva, the Chassam Sofer writes, even if Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliath is a minag, but it's like a Kabbalah l'dvar mitzvah, and it becomes a neder, and there's lo yachel devoroi min haTorah. The Baal Yachal is min haTorah, even though Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliath is midarabanan. And many achronim disagree with the Chassam Sofer. It's against the Gemara Meforeshes in the Dom Tazvav. Mitzvah derabanan is only Baal Yachal derabanan. A mitzvah derabanan cannot become a neder d'oraisa. The Marsham, Sefer Das Torah Hilchos Shchita Yoredei Semachov Gimel, and the Levushe Mordechai, one of the greatest Hungarian poskim before the Holocaust, Reb Mordechai Winkler, he was the Rav and Mad. Both disagree with the Chassam Sofer, and they say, even if we would say Yom Tov Sheni Shegolis is a mitzvah derabanan, not only a minhag, a mitzvah derabanan is only a neder derabanan. A mitzvah derabanan cannot become a neder d'oraisa. But the Chassam Sofer writes differently. And this brings us back to the Maharshal. So the Maharshal says, a minhag shekiblu kol Yisrael is harsher than other minhagim. It is a chiyuv derabanan. So this was a controversy regarding a psak of the Yad HaMelech. So what is Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliath? According to some Rishonim a minhag, according to others a takana. Even if it's a minhag, it has chumr yesera. Not only Al Titoish Teres Imecho, according to the Chasam Sofer Bad Yachal, according to everyone, it has the status and the chumrah of a chiyuv derabbanan. Now I want to share with you two psakim. I know many Rabbanim and Chasher Rabbanim disagree with me, but this is my opinion. And I've given these psakim for years and years. And I know hundreds of people follow these psakim. And I feel quite confident. So let me share with you two psakim, Aloha Lamaisa, which are very relevant regarding Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golias Lebnei Chutz La'aretz. So as a fundamental introduction, some Gedolim paskin that there is no such a thing as Shnei Yom Tov Shel Golias in Eretz Yisrael. There is no such a thing. And even Chutznikim visiting Eretz Yisrael only have one day. Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golias is exclusively for Bnei HaGoyla. Someone comes to Eretz Yisrael, even if Datoy Lachzor, one day. Ein halacha kemoisam, and I want to make this very clear. When the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah are on the same page, Yosef HaTzadik and Moshe Rabbeinu, and the Noisei Kelim, Aron v'chur toimchim biyodoi mezeh echad umezeh echad, and I mean the Taz and the Magen Avraham agree that is halacha. V'kol aruchos shebeyolim lo yazisu otam mimkomam. However, the dissenting view that there is no Shnei Yom Tov Shel Golias in Eretz Yisrael is not a Das Yochid. It's not an esoteric opinion that we find in some strange sefer. Chacham Tzvi, Rabbi Yankov Emden, his great son, Shilas Yavitz, Shoel Meishav, Rabbi Yosef Shol Natanzon, and a few tshuvas agrees with his grandfather, the Chacham Tzvi. Shulchan Aruch Harav, one of the greatest poskim, Ledoiroi v'Ledoiris Olam, the Avnei Nezer, Reb David al-Karlino in She'ilas David. I just mentioned 6. And I mentioned these 6 names because each of them was a giant. Each of them was one of the greatest halachic authorities of his time. Let me make this very clear. Because the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah reign supreme, and the Magen Avraham and the Taz. What I mean to say is, Chazye le'itzterufa b'mokim sofek. So psak number 1, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of young couples, chutznikim, both husband and wife are from America, from Europe, but they live a few years in Eretz Yisrael. And this is very, very common in our day and age. Young couples feel the right place to be right after the chassan is learning Torah in Eretz Yisrael, Avira di Eretz Yisrael, Machkim. Most of them plan ultimately to go back to Chutz La'aretz. Many of them are smuchan al shulchan horeim, and the parents are not willing to support them all their lives in Eretz Yisrael. And my psak is, if they're here for a few years, 1 day, not 2 days, and that is not defined as Datoy Lachzor. Datoy Lachzor is when you have a fixed date. Now, many times I apologize, and many of you might tell me them, no, that in halacha usually there are no fixed dates or numbers. So I can't tell you exactly how much time does a young couple need to live in Eretz Yisrael or plan to live in Eretz Yisrael. They should hold 1 day. I can't say. Is it 23 months or 24 months or 25 months? 1 year? 2, 3, 4, 5? And when I say if you don't have a fixed date, I don't mean you need to have a fixed date. The 15th of January. Chof Daled Sivan. No. I mean, as long as it's open, even though basically your plan is at some stage to go back to Chutz La'aretz. But you're here for years, and you don't know exactly when you'll be going back, then you hold 1 day. The source of this question is in Shuvas Radbaz. Shuvas Radbaz, Cheleg Daled Simen Ayin Gimel. The Radbaz doesn't deal with the chutzner coming to Eretz Yisrael, but the other way around. The Bnei Eretz Yisrael that go to Eretz Mitzrayim. Egypt was a huge Jewish center in those days. Cairo, but primarily Alexandria. In the days of Chazal, Alexandria was a huge Jewish center. The Radbaz was the chief rabbi of Egypt, of Mitzrayim. And he deals with people that moved from Eretz Yisrael to Mitzrayim. And they want to go back to Eretz Yisrael. But nevertheless, the Radbaz says, as long as they live in Mitzrayim, they have all the dinam of Ben Chutz La'aretz. Not only lechumre v'lekula. And I'm quoting one line from the Radbaz, even though the Radbaz writes it at greater length. Im ein da'atom lachzor, o she'okru dirosam legamrei, then they have a din of Bnei Chutz La'aretz. So what is this dual language? Ein da'atom lachzor, o she'okru diratam legamrei. Obviously, okru dirosam legamrei afal pi she'da'atom lachzor. So there seem to be two different interpretations of the Radbaz and Siman Tov Tzadik Vav, the Orcha Shulchan and the Mishnah Berurah. The Orcha Shulchan's understanding is Okra Derosam Lagamre means they live here. And it's not essentially very temporary. That Elachzer is, you didn't give up your apartment in Chutz La'aretz. You didn't give up your apartment back there. You have your house there, and you're renting here, and you plan to go back to your other home. And they no longer have a home in the point of departure. They only have one home here. That is okru dirosam lagamre, and they hold 2 days if they're in Chutz La'aretz, 1 day if they're in Eretz Yisrael. The Mishnah Berurah, when he brings the Radbaz, and that is in Sif Kot Yud Gimel, the Mishnah Berurah writes, because we assume that if they find a decent parnosa in Mitzrayim, Eino Izaz Misham, they won't be going back to Eretz Yisrael. So according to the Mishnah Berurah, if it is clear that they will be going back there, then they need to hold 2 days in Eretz Yisrael. Because the reasoning of the Radbaz is, if they find a parnosa, they'll stay put. But these couples plan to go back. I think the Orcha Shulchan is far more reasonable and misyashev beloshen haradbaz. Okru dirosam legamri. The Radbaz doesn't say, what is their ultimate plan? What he writes is, Imein datam lachzar, oh! Okru dirosam lagamra. I think okru dirosam lagamra means they have nowhere to go back to. They don't have a home waiting for them. They live here, lock, stock, and barrel. Everything they have is here, not there. That is okru dirosam lagamra. And in that case, they have a din of bnei hamakoim. So this is one of the popular questions today. Who is a greater posek, Orcha Shulchan or Mishnah Berurah? And I am extremely annoyed when this comes up. Both were great halachic authorities. So in our day and age, most Bnei Torah adhere to the psukim of the Mishnah Berurah. And that's great. Sometimes I hear people saying, why was the Mishnah Berurah zeicha to be the posek achron? Because of the tzidkus. The Mishnah Berurah was a tzaddik yesod olam. But the Mishnah Berurah has this awesome authority, not just because of his tzidkus, but because of his gadlus. It's an amazing sefer. The yashrus of the Mishnah Berurah is phenomenal. Dvorav kilurin le'einayim bekol mokim. As straight as an arrow. Yashris muflo'ah. Arab Chaim Volozhin writes, Kol chachmi yisrael lo nishtapchu ela b'yosher svarosam. Hayosher mechaveroi. Godel Hemeno. So the Mishnah Berurah is a giant, but so is the Aruch HaShulchan, and each of them was a giant in his own merit. The Aruch HaShulchan was known as one of the great poskim of his generation. He wrote many tshuvas. The Aruch HaShulchan is on Dalet Chelkei Shulchan Aruch. The Chofetz Chaim didn't write tshuvas, and we know nothing of his Torah in Yoreh De'ah and Ezra Choshe Mishpat. That doesn't diminish his greatness. But the comparison is not a sensible comparison. Both were great Gedolim. Regarding the Radbaz, I think the Aruch HaShulchan is far more reasonable. But I wouldn't dare to go against the Mishnah Berurah. I think the Mishnah Berurah would agree in our case, one day. What does the Mishnah Berurah write? If they will find a decent parnosa, they'll probably stay there. Most of these young couples very much would wish to stay in Eretz Yisrael. They would love it. Most of them are dependent on their parents. So the parents will dictate, we're not willing to support you all your life. You got to come home at some stage. But it is quite common if the younger man finds a shtela in Eretz Yisrael, if the young wife finds a good job in Eretz Yisrael, many of them stay in Eretz Yisrael and their parents are happy about it. And therefore I think, in most cases, even according to the Mishnah Berurah, a young couple that lives for years in Eretz Yisrael and they don't have a designated time when exactly they'll be going back, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. They just go with the flow and wait. They want to be here as long as the parents will let them. They want to be here as long as possible. And some of them ultimately will stay here. It is exactly what the Mishnah Berurah describes. B'shittas Radbaz. If they'll find a decent parnosa, they'll stay there. And therefore they have a minhag of bnei, they have the luch of bnei hamokim. And that's why I paskin. If a young couple comes for a year and he knows when the year is up, he's going back 2 days. But if he's here indefinitely, vaguely, basically, they do plan to go back. But they're here for an indefinite period and they would like to stay here, in principle, then one day they have a din of B'nai Eretz Yisrael Kol Davar. My other psak regards people that are somewhat older than the young couples. And in our age of abundance, this is very, very common. Some people have a house in Eretz Yisrael, they have a house in America. Part of the year they're here, part of the year they're there. So what din do they have when they're in Eretz Yisrael in their own homes? 1 day or 2 days. And I say, once upon a time in days of yore, there was no such a thing that a person lives in 2 different places. Either he lives here and he visits there, or he lives there and he visits here. But with the unbelievable advance of communications and transportation, we're living in a different world. Why is transportation relevant? Because once to come from Medina Sayom to Eretz Yisrael, you sat on the back of a camel or on the boat of a ship that might get there, might not get there. And it took weeks, sometimes months, to travel from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael and back. So obviously there was no such a thing, you live in 2 places. Today you hop on a plane, and in 3 hours, 4 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, you're here. And you're back in half a day. So who says we need to decide, are you a ben Eretz Yisrael or a ben Chutz La'aretz? You could be both. So what is the definition? And on what does it depend? 4 different criteria. That's the way I see it. And these are not halachic criteria, but more practical criteria. But they define halacha. And I say, what characterizes a person's place of living? Where does he live? If a person has a home, his own home in Eretz Yisrael, maybe he lives here. If he comes to Eretz Yisrael even 10 times a year and he spends a few months, but he stays in hotels, every time in a different hotel room, then he's a visitor. Because fundamentally, people like to live in a home. Most people at Seoul own a house. Many people in America don't own their homes, but they rent. But their lease is a long-term lease, and they live in the same home for 10 years, for 20 years, for decades. They furnish the home. All their personal possessions that give a person a feel of a home are theirs. They don't go to in a hotel room and look around. The pictures on the walls are their family pictures. Everything is familiar. So criteria number one, you have your own home in Eretz Yisrael. Criteria number two, you stay in Eretz Yisrael longer than the average tourist does. Not a week or 2 weeks or 10 days or 3 weeks. Anywhere between 2 and 3 and 4 months. That is no longer the custom of a visitor. Tourists usually stay 2 weeks, 3 weeks maximum, 4 weeks. So my second criteria is you're here for an extended period. Doesn't need to be more than 6 months. The Imre Emes, the great Gerer Rebbe, before the Holocaust, planned to buy a home in Eretz Yisrael and stay here if you're part of the year and stay there with the Chassidim in Poland. And he turned to the Velvel Mintzberg. Shalas Tshuva She'eres Yisrael, we find a tshuva to the Gerer Rebbe. And the Gerer Rebbe inquired, ultimately, when I will, Baruch Hashem, have my own house in Eretz Yisrael, my own home, and I will be staying part of the year in Eretz Yisrael, would I hold 1 day or 2 days? And Rav Mintzberg said, depends where you're going to be more time. More time there or more time here. And I say it doesn't depend more time. Because Rav Mintzberg also assumed, where do you live, there or here? If you live more time there, then you live there and you visit here. If you're more time in Eretz Yisrael, you live here and you visit there. But I say, I live here and I live there. So it doesn't depend where I am more. Number one, you have your own home. Number two, you're here a longer period than the average tourist. Number three, you don't have kids in elementary school. Because obviously you live where your family is. And if your children go to elementary school and they need to be there, it is unreasonable that a person's wife and children live there and he lives here unless he gives a divorce. You live where your family is. But if you no longer have little children, you're married off your children, or you even have your bigger kids, but they're not at home, they're in dormitory, they're in yeshiva. You don't have kids in elementary school. That's criteria number three. Number four, your parnasa doesn't necessitate you to be there. You don't work in a factory, or you don't have an office job in which you need to punch a card every day and prove that you're there. You're not a Rebbe in a Cheder or a Magid in a yeshiva, which necessitates you be with your Talmidim. Your business is in your phone that you hold in your hand. Sham Beisoy, Shmuel Hanavi. Your business is in your phone. I know so many people that live in Eretz Yisrael that work in America. Investors, people that are in counseling, Eitzegebers, as we call them in Yiddish. I know doctors that live in Eretz Yisrael and they service medical institutions and patients in Chutz La'aretz. And all the consultations are by video conferencing, by Zoom. Sometimes Zoom isn't clear enough, isn't reliable enough. So if you don't need to be on the floor in your job, you don't have kids in elementary school, you have your own house in Eretz Yisrael, and you're here 2 or 3 or 4 months a year, when you're here, you live in Eretz Yisrael. The basic concept that a person could live in 2 places, I have a source that goes back 500 years. Shalas Tshuvas Marit Tzahalon, Maritatz, Simen Tzadik Beis. Don't fall off your seats when I'll tell you the story he is dealing with. So there was a person that had one house in Eretz Yisrael and one house in Turkey. Part of the year he was in his house in Eretz Yisrael and part of the year in Turkey. He also had two wives, one wife in Eretz Yisrael and one wife in Turkey. So his Turkish wife was waiting for him to come there. His Eretz Yisraelic wife longed for him in Eretz Yisrael. He spent some time, a few months a year, in his home with his wife in Turkey, and some part of the year with his wife in his home in Eretz Yisrael. And the Merit Saran was asked, 1 day or 2 days? And he writes, when he's in Eretz Yisrael 1 day, when he's in Chutz La'aretz 2 days. Obviously, he was a Sephardi, because Ashkenazim had Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom 500 years ago. So what we learn from this tshuva is, not always do we need to decide, does he live there or live here? He lives here and he lives there. He has a house and a wife in Turkey, another wife and another house in Eretz Yisrael. Would that be only because he had two wives? I say no. What's the difference? He has one wife. But when he's here, she's Turkish, and when she's there, she's in Eretz Yisrael. Why would that make a difference? His wife comes along with him. Yes. If his wife never comes along with him, and he comes on his own, then he doesn't live here. As I said before, you live where your family lives. But if he comes with his wife, so why would he need two wives? Why wouldn't one be enough? So those are my criteria. And that's my psak. Many disagree, but I am thoroughly convinced, and I feel very confident in giving this psak, and many people, that's their minhag. So on one hand, I am not Mekel and Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliyos. But I do say, the shit of the Chacham Tzvi, which many Gedolim follow, Chazia Leitzterufe, and therefore, in these two scenarios that I described, I paskin 1 day. So I think this is a very important, a very interesting shiur. We started off with a fundamental concept of Shnei Yom Tovim Shel Goliyos, and then we went into some interesting questions halacha l'maaseh. And in Parshas Boy, I always come back to the Ramban at the end of the Parsha. And the Ramban explains, why is it so important to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim? So many mitzvahs are all Ezeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, Sholosh Regalim, Shabbos. All the various mitzvahs associated with Bchora. Bchor Odom, Bchor Behemet Tahira, Bchor Behemet Tameya. All of them are Ezeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. So why is it so important that we forever remember Yetzias Mitzrayim? I quote the Ramban. מן הניסים הגדולים והמפורסמים עוד המועד בניסים הנסתורים שהם יסוד כל התורה כולו. אין לנו חלק בתורס מוישה עד שנדע שכל דבורנו ומקרנו הם ניסים, אין בהם טבע ומנהגו של עולם. כל דבורנו ומקרנו, everything that occurs, everything that happens, they are all miracles. There is no nature, and there is no incidental happenings. There is no nature. Ein behem teva. The Ramban wasn't a batlin. The Ramban was a giant amongst giants. He towered above all the others, and he was a ish eshkoilas. Commentator, Poisek, leader, Mikubel, philosopher. The Rambam was everything. And his contemporary was the Rambam. The Rambam definitely wasn't a batlin. One of the greatest physicians of his age, the greatest Jewish philosopher ever. The Moreh Nevuchim is the Mishnah Torah, the very first codifier of Torah Hashem. And the Rambam, in the very first of the 13 Yesodis, Yud Gimel Ikrei Emunah, wasn't formulated by the Rambam, the short version that we have in the Sidurim. We don't know who formulated that. but it definitely is loyal to the Rambam. And the Rambam expounds the Yud Gimel Ikram and the last perek of Masechet Sanhedrin and perek of Mishnah. אני מאמין באמונה שלמה שהבורא יסבורך שמאי הוא בורא ומנהיג לכל הברואים והוא לבדו עושה ועושה ויעשה לכל המעשים. בורא ומנהיג. He is the creator and he is the mover. He makes everything happen and he guides the world as it moves forward. Boire umanig. The Ramban also uses dual language called Dvorenu v'Mikreinu. Ein behem teva v'menhogoi shel olam. I think both the Ramban and both the Rambam refer to the laws of nature, the fundamental laws of nature. Biology, zoology, chemistry, physics, astronomy, everything. Hydrodynamics, astrophysics, everything. But they also refer to the course of history. Boire v'manig, dvarenu v'mikrenu, en be'em teva v'menhogei shel olam. What? There are no laws of nature? The Rambam and the Ramban weren't aware that there are laws of nature? That this world is somewhat predetermined? Of course they were aware. But who makes the laws of nature work? And why do they exist? It is only because they're part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's creation. He is the one that determined the laws of nature. And they work because he makes them work. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu could, in a split second, create 1 million different universes, solar systems. Each of them would have its own unique and different set of natural laws, a different set of physics, chemistry, biology, and he could create another 1 million worlds that would be totally spontaneous, with no laws of nature. Total chaos, and everything would be spontaneous. Einoid melvadoi. Bal hayacholes v'bal hakochot kulam. Yes, there are laws of nature, but they exist because HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes them exist, and they work because he makes them work. Retzonoi haposhut yisborach shemoi. Hu boire v'maneg l'kol habruim, והוא לבדו עשה ועושה ויעשה לכל המעשים, כל דבורנו ומקרנו הם בהם טבע ומנהגו של עולם. ניסים. And in Masechet Tanis, one of the many stories we learn about Reb Chanina ben Doisa. He was the Baal Moifes, Baal Maisa, the wonder worker, the miracle man. And his daughter wants to light candles. Probably it was Erev Shabbos, and she comes to light Ner Shabbos. And the candles don't light. And suddenly she realizes it's not oil, it's vinegar. And she starts crying, and she runs to his father, Abba, there's no oil at home. How would I light Neros? And he does a miracle. So usually we're inspired by the miracle. No, it's not the miracle that you need to appreciate. Reb Chanina ben Doisa made miracles every day. It is the simplicity of his language. And he tells his daughter, Biti ma ichpas lach. Why are you sad? Nothing happened. Everything will turn out fine. Everything will be okay. Misha omar l'shemen v'yadlik, yoim alachayimetz v'yadlik. But it's not the same, Abba. Oil is inflammable. Vinegar is not. And Reb Chanina ben Doisa says, Ma yichpas lach. My dear lovely daughter, Ma yichpas lach. Why is oil inflammable and vinegar is not? Those are laws of nature. But if HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, then right here and now in our home, vinegar will be inflammable as well. And that is what transpired. Because everything is biyad Hashem. Things work because He makes them work. There are laws of nature, and the Rambam and the Ramban were very well aware that there are laws of nature. Einoid malvadoi. There is no intrinsic power or force in the world besides HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it is with His ultimate wisdom, Chochma Elokis, He devised, He formulated all those laws of nature. And many times I tell Talmidim, it is only once a day that we define HaKadosh Baruch Hu as Noisan HaTorah. It is 100 times a day that we call HaKadosh Baruch Hu Melech HaOlam, King of the universe. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Noisan HaTorah, and He is Melech HaOlam. He gave us Torah. He gave us science as well. Science exists because HaKadosh Baruch Hu created it. And that is why HaKadosh Baruch Hu made these unbelievable supernatural miracles. Menanisam hagadolim v'hamifrasamim. Or the moide benisam anistorim sheheim yesod kol haTorah kula. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has His hand in the natural and in the supernatural. And to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they are all the same. No difference at all. So we need to believe in Nisam Anastorim. Shekol dvoreinu v'mekreinu hem nisim. Ein behem teva v'menhagoi shaloilo. We should once again be zoichu to nisim gedoylem v'mifrasamim. And as we read the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, Ki yameitzeschem me'eretz Mitzrayim, arenu niflois, bebias goel tzedek bemheiro v'yomeinu omen.